Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me in the first half hour today. We're going to be spending some time talking about the transgender movement and how to think about this. And we have, first of all, an article by Ryan Anderson, Genital Preferences is Now Transphobic, and we'll talk about some of that in just a minute. And that's one of the articles we've posted. New book out, When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. And if you are not familiar, Dr. Ryan Anderson is an individual that works with the Heritage Foundation, founder and editor of Public Discourse, author of this book as well as some others, Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. Also was one of the co-authors of the book, What is Marriage, Man and Woman, a Defense, as well as Debating Religious Liberty and Discrimination. And Ryan Anderson joins us now by phone. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. Happy to be with you.
Let's, if we can, talk about this idea of the transgender moment. That's part of the subtitle. It's the first chapter in your book. And in some respects, this has come on relatively quickly. You can think about all the conversations at Point of View during the 1980s, the 1990s, 21st century, when we talked about homosexuality. It almost seems like the day after the decision was rendered on same-sex marriage, we heard nothing about, nothing except issues like transgenderism. What about this transgender moment that we find ourselves in?
That's exactly right. A generation ago, when Harry met Sally, the debate on that movie was whether or not men and women could really be just friends. Now, the debate in my book, When Harry Became Sally, it's whether men can become women, whether women can become men, whether boys can be trapped in the bodies of girls, whether girls can be trapped in the bodies of boys. And it seems to many Americans to have come out of nowhere with an incredible speed. That the acronym LGBT, for most Americans, the focus has always been on the L, the G, and the B, right? They talked about gay marriage, marriage equality, the redefinition of marriage. And then all of a sudden, 2 years ago, when Bruce Jenner went on 2020 for his primetime interview, that was when many Americans first heard of this transgender moment. And then we've been living in it ever since, with the Obama bathroom policies, with the Obama military policies, with the Obama health care policies. And now Trump is, responding to some of those things. We have to see what happens in the military. That's what we're now finding ourselves in the midst of.
Now, again, to be fair, you also talk about the fact that many people at least saw information about, probably didn't go to the movie Danish Girl, but that is, of course, the first known subject of sex reassignment surgery. That happened in the 1930s. But again, it wasn't top of the mind. And like you said, LGBT, we've heard a lot about L and G, sometimes B, virtually nothing about T, but now that's kind of the big issue. And so a lot of people have really depended upon the few researchers that have worked in this field to try to pull that together. And one of those you talk about early on is transgender medicine at Johns Hopkins, because I have quoted from some of the studies that were done and also some of the conclusions by Dr. Paul McHugh. But since you've studied that, give us an overview of what was taking place there at Johns Hopkins and why he has, in a sense, changed his mind.
Yeah, so, to a certain extent, Dr. McHugh, this book is meant to vindicate Dr. McHugh. Dr. McHugh received a world-class education, first at Harvard College, then at Harvard Medical School. He then found himself as the psychiatrist-in-chief at Johns Hopkins Hospital and the chair of the psychiatry program at Johns Hopkins Medical School. And Hopkins had earlier opened a sex reassignment clinic back in the 60s. And so now it's the 1970s. McHugh's been installed as the head of psychiatry there. He asked his colleagues to conduct studies to see what the long-term outcomes have been for these patients. The results of those studies are that while the patients were happy as a cosmetic matter with the surgery they received at Hopkins, they weren't showing any noticeable, significantly improved psychosocial outcomes in terms of anxiety, depression, substance abuse, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, suicide attempts, and completed suicides. So McHugh back in 1979 shut down the sex reassignment clinic at Hopkins, and it remained shut down up until last year when Hopkins reopened it, not in light of new evidence. There's no new evidence that you can actually reassign sex because sex isn't assigned in the first place, but partly because of pressure from activist groups.
Well, and again, let's say if I can move forward because we only have a short amount of time with you. One of the things, Dr. Ryan Anderson, that we have talked about before you've joined us is how this is promoted in the schools. And you have early on a gender-bred person and a gender unicorn. And this is a good example of now gender is seen as fluid. It's self-defined. It is not absolute, and it certainly is not tied to what you call genital preferences, is it?
No, so what's happening right now is that we have children are being indoctrinated in the public schools throughout the nation to believe that they have a gender identity that can be both fluid and plastic, that it exists along a spectrum, and they have to identify what their gender identity is and then what their gender expression is. The gender-bred person and the gender unicorn, two different graphics here, also list romantic attraction and sexual attraction as two other spectrums. And so students are being told that disconnected from their bodily sex, they have these different identities, gender identities, sexual identities, and they have to figure out where they fall along these spectrums. They have to craft their identity. And so as a result, it's not just students who suffer from gender dysphoria who will be implicated by these transgender activist ideologies, but all of America's children are now going to be implicated through this ideology.
Well, part of the problem is as I've talked about, and you have as well, I've done commentaries, sometimes quoted you, is that a number of young people, not a majority, but a number of them actually do go through some kind of gender dysphoria, or they have some difficulty sorting out their sexuality. But over time, if we don't bombard them with hormones or actually bring them to a gender reassignment clinic, most of them, I would say, and you can give us again the statistics that we have found, actually begin to sort that out. So when we assume that as we're teaching a gender-bred person or talk about the gender unicorn in grade school, that's not a real good time for them to be making decisions about where they're going to be in their 20s, is it?
Of course not. None of us would be wanting to be stuck with the consequences of decisions that we made when we were teenagers. I'm sure you, me, our listeners right now are very thankful that decisions we made when we were in middle school and high school, we're not living with the consequences still today. And yet we are now encouraging children to make consequences that they will be living with for the rest of their lives when it comes to their gender identity. We're encouraging children to take puberty-blocking drugs, to take testosterone when they're girls, to take estrogen when they're boys. What we really need to do is give them time to feel comfortable in their own bodies. The best science, and I quote these studies in the book, show that 80 to 95% of children who are struggling with a gender identity conflict naturally grow out of it if they're given the time to continue their physical maturation.
Well said.
But no one knows the consequences of puberty-blocking drugs.
Well, again, we'll get into that in a little bit more after the break. Ryan Anderson with us, When Harry Became Sally, 250-page book. We have information about it on our website. Also, one of the articles that appeared in the Weekly Standard on genital preferences is now transphobic. We'll talk more about that with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, we have once again been hearing that we need to do something to stem gun violence. Even though most gun purchases are significantly regulated, are there any gun law reforms being proposed that make some sense? Well, Benjamin Durker, writing in The Federalist, proposes some reforms of the National Instant Criminal Background Check System that would make a difference. The system is composed of 3 databases, but not all relevant data is listed. For example, the Air Force failed to provide important information about the man who killed more than 24 people at the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. Legislation has been proposed to address this problem of inadequate records, but failed to pass in Congress. Another piece of legislation that has been proposed but not passed would increase criminal prosecutions of felons who tried to buy guns and would also criminalize straw purchases. The bill proposed by Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Charles Grassley would address the problem of people who lie on applications. Cruz says that in 2010 there were 48,000 felons and fugitives who lied and illegally tried to purchase guns. They prosecuted only 44 of them. David French writes about a way to deal with people who already have guns and pose a danger to society. It's called a gun violence restraining order. Various versions of these laws have been working their way through states, and it would empower family members and others close to a potential shooter to use the courts to temporarily take an individual's guns away. Obviously, it needs various safeguards. French shows how this law might have stopped at least 4 of the mass shootings in the last 4 years. We keep hearing that we need to do something. I think these types of common sense gun law reforms might actually prevent the next mass shooting. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Ryan Anderson with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his new book, When Harry Became Sally. 250 pages. No way we'll cover all of that in the next couple of minutes, but let me just mention again, this is a book that has been endorsed by some people we've mentioned before, Dr. Paul McHugh, for example, and Paul Vitz, as well as Robert George and Marianne Glendon, to mention just a few. And so you'll find some of that very helpful. And again, this is a book that will get you into a lot of the facts and figures and the studies, an extensive endnotes that will give you some documentation for some of the things that Ryan Anderson talks about in his book. And before we get into some of the other aspects of sex reassignment, it might be good to focus just for a moment on the fact that you put chapter 3 in the book about detransitioners who tell their stories, because you give us, if you will, a human face, and you recognize that what some people thought was going to make them happy or to resolve some of their gender dysphoria really didn't.
Yeah, Chapter 3 was the hardest chapter to research and write because the stories that are told there are so heartbreaking. These involve people who transitioned thinking it would bring them that wholeness and that happiness, that fulfillment, and then 5, 10, 15 years later, they regret it because it didn't bring them what they were seeking. And then they try to detransition and re-identify with their bodies. The stories that are particularly heartbreaking are the ones that involve people who transitioned as teenagers. Frequently, these are high school girls who weren't quite fitting in. They weren't your stereotypical all-American girl. And as a result of that not fitting in, they were identifying as boys. And then they tell stories of going to see gender experts who never discussed with them any of the underlying possible causes for their gender dysphoria, never explored alternative treatment options, and after 3 or 4 visits, prescribe them testosterone. And then they regret 5 or 10 years later that they're now infertile. They've now made permanent damages to their bodies. Sometimes they had mastectomies. So they had removed their breast tissue. They now have, their voice has changed. They have a 5 o'clock shadow, all because they didn't fit into a societal stereotype of what girls or women are supposed to be. And so that should immediately caution us to not be overly rigid in our own understanding of what's true for the two sexes, and not to stigmatize people who don't fit into those visions of gender and gender roles. We need to be more capacious in what are the possibilities for real men and real women, real boys and real girls, so we don't contribute to gender dysphoria.
Now, you also talk about, as we've been focusing on a little bit, this idea of sex reassignment surgery. Dr. Paul McHugh and others were involved in that. But even at a very young age, you have hormonal treatment sometimes given, and then the final step of sex reassignment surgery. But again, the argument is I was trapped in the wrong body, but the surgery doesn't seem to bring about the kind of change that was anticipated.
No, so what I point out in the book, you now hear the phrase sex assigned at birth.
Yes.
But sex isn't assigned at birth, and that's why sex reassignment procedures aren't successful at actually reassigning sex. You can't reassign what wasn't assigned in the first place. And so that's merely at the physical level. But then as a consequence, at the social level, it proves really difficult to live as if the opposite sex. This isn't merely because of stigma, although that's part of it, which is why we shouldn't stigmatize people. But even apart from stigma, in the most transgender-friendly communities, it's still difficult to live as transgender because it's difficult to live when you're not your actual body, right? To present yourself as a woman when you're actually a man, to present yourself as a man when you're actually a woman. That's going to be difficult, and that's why we frequently see that many of the same psychosocial struggles remain in terms of anxiety or depression or substance abuse.
And again, just real quickly, we might mention that there's a real question as to whether or not these puberty-blocking therapies are safe. This is the kind of thing where we would want to have clinical trials, all sorts of evaluation. We're heading down a road that if it weren't, in a sense, being lauded by the LGBT community, we would be asking for all sorts of safeguards, wouldn't we?
Of course. There are no long-term studies on what the consequences are of blocking puberty indefinitely in boys and girls. There are no large, random, representative samples that are evaluated over a long-term period on what those long-term consequences would be. It's entirely experimental. And it's particularly amazing that people would go for this in this current generation when we don't want to have hormones in our cows, right? We eat at restaurants that have hormone-free meat, and yet we're willing to place children on hormones to block their puberty or to give testosterone to girls, to give estrogen to boys. It's remarkable the types of medical interventions that are entirely experimental we're willing to conduct on human beings, all in the name of political correctness.
Yes. Just before we go, I want to get into some of the myths that you've run into, because there's a lot spread around, and one of those gets into the kind of the bathroom issue that you talk about later on, and that is there are people that disagree with you that will say things like, well, then you're saying that transgender individuals pose a threat to those in the bathrooms, and the argument is, no, that's not the point we're making. We're making is once you say that both men and women or how they identify can come in there, predators could use that. But this is a debate right now where oftentimes people that oppose some of the views that we talk about here on Point of View are misrepresenting the concerns that we raise. Haven't you found that to be the case?
Oh, of course. They intentionally want to say that we're claiming that transgender people are perverts, and that's not the argument. No matter how many times we say that's not the argument, it's almost as if the other side is intentionally trying to spin the argument. The concern here is a privacy concern, that for the same reason why a boy who identifies as a girl might feel uncomfortable in the boys' locker room, we can understand why the girls would feel uncomfortable with him in their locker room. That's based on privacy. But then the safety concern is that if you allow anyone into the locker room merely based upon their gender identity, then actual perverts will pretend to be transgender, disguise themselves in a wig and a dress, enter that facility in order to engage in sex crimes, whether it's peeping Tom, whether it's indecent exposure. And it's not surprising after Target changed its fitting room policy, several men were caught doing just this. And I mentioned those cases in the book because I want to give people the evidence here. I don't want people just to believe my say-so. The book has several hundred endnotes, 30 pages worth of sources at the end, just to document all of the statistics, all of the science, and here, all of the public policy concerns.
Well, and I might just mention Chapter 8 is policy in the common interest, and that's where it surfaces so often in our conversations here, whether it was the edicts that it came down from the Obama administration, whether it's some of the debate and discussion, something I talked about in a show previous to this, about what is happening at the state legislature. So this is why this is a very valuable resource, 250 pages. We've also posted your article. It's really an interview that Jonathan Lash did with you in the Weekly Standard, so people can read a little bit about that before they go and get a copy of the book. And we also have a link to the Heritage Foundation, so that if people wanted to contact you, have you come and speak, or do a number of other things, that's available. So as they land on your webpage, what else will they find as they go to heritage.org and go to the section for Ryan Anderson?
Sure. I mean, so the Heritage Foundation, we cover all of public policy, foreign policy, economic policy, social policy. I work on marriage, on life, on religious liberty, and now on gender identity. And then you can get the book wherever books are sold. The book's at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, it's on the Kindle store, the iBook store, the Nook. And I should add, I have a PhD. You've been referring to me as Dr. Anderson. This is a book not written for PhDs. This book is written for normal people.
Yes.
I wrote this book so that ordinary Americans can understand what's going on in this transgender moment and can understand what the truth is about the human person and the human body.
Let me recommend all the books that Ryan Anderson's been a part of. Truth Overruled, which deals, of course, with marriage and religious freedom. What is Marriage, which is one that he co-authored with one individual I mentioned just a minute ago, Robert George, and others. And, of course, this one, When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. And Ryan Anderson, we always appreciate you being on the program. Look forward to the next opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Let's take a break, and we'll take your phone calls. Let's open up the phones. I see at least one call already coming in. We'll get to more in just a minute. 1-800-351-1212. We'll carry this on for just a few more minutes, but also want to focus on my commentary today related to gun law reform. So that's certainly a fair game issue, and I'll talk about not only today's commentary, but a commentary that will be coming out tomorrow. The whole question about whether or not you can actually buy guns online and what kind of dangers those pose. We'll get into a couple of those issues since that's in the news as well. And if you'd like to join the conversation on a couple of issues we've surfaced and others that we will do so, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. For those of you that love theology, apologetics, and Christian view, Lee Strobel is going to be in studio with us in just about a half an hour. His new book coming out, The Case for Miracles. We'll be back right after this.
With the way things are going right now, there's got to be a source of truth somewhere.
Eric lives in California, and he's listened to Point of View since he was a child hanging around his dad's auto shop in Nevada. He says it's his only trustworthy source of information about what's happening in the world.
Well, I feel bad because I have not been donating, and I'll tell you what, I'm getting back to that because just recently I realized with all the junk going on with all the media, with all these news things, the only one that I count on is you guys, and what would I do if you guys weren't there? I don't know what I'd do. Where would I get my news? And I would be dead in water. So I got to do my part.
Make sure you do your part, like Eric. Join the Truth Team. Get all the details by calling 1-800-347-5151 or visit online, pointofview.net/team. Support the truth and make a difference for the future. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View.
The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking for a few minutes with Dr. Ryan Anderson. He had to go on to another appointment. But again, his new book is When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. And let's take some of your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. Originally, we had him scheduled for an hour, but he had to go somewhere else. So I will try to answer the questions that hopefully we can put on the table. But if not, we'll send them on to him or get him on for a future opportunity. Let's go to Texas, first of all. KCTA. Susan, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask the doctor when it became unacceptable to just have a young man who happened to be a little more gentle, maybe artistically talented, and maybe a female who was athletic and maybe good in math and science. Why was that somehow not fitting in to where they would actually think, well, I'm in the wrong body? Why can't you just be a gentle male who could maybe progress in art or...
Sure.
You see what I'm saying?
I completely agree. When we've talked about homosexuality with Sue Boland and everybody else, I see it as like, and not a bell-shaped curve, but like two curves that overlap dramatically. And we all know that we've seen girls that were labeled as tomboys or boys that were labeled as sensitive. And I think we have, in some respects, because of culture, and that is one of the chapters in his book, Transgender and Culture, is the case. And I would have to say that, first of all, because people started believing that they were born in the wrong body, I mean, maybe that all the way theologically goes all the way back to Genesis 3. You know, because of the fall, we have every part of us, but it's, including our sexuality, is somehow flawed. And so because of that, we've had all sorts of circumstances or situations where individuals maybe had some kind of gender dysphoria or they didn't know what to do. But what you're talking about is, where did the culture begin to say, well, if you're this way, then you're that? And I certainly think that that movie, the Danish girl in the 1930s, is part of that, because there came to be, at least in American culture, and I think in Western culture, but even in Eastern cultures as well, this idea that men are strong, they're rough. They're, to use the example sometimes people like to use, they're the buffaloes, you know, got a tough hide and they're rough and tough. And girls, well, they're like butterflies, or they're like flowers. And yes, that is generally true, but the culture, I think, sometimes has done a great harm by so defining male and female in that way, as to have those who didn't fit quite into that stereotype wondering if they were born into the wrong body. So I think your point's well taken. Part of it is theological and part of it's cultural.
It's such an odd thought to have when you have a child, and of course, say they're a little girl. All the transgender and lesbian people that call in that say, well, I didn't fit in because I was athletic. I didn't want to play with the little girls, etc. I didn't like dolls. They like maybe more active activities, things like that. And the thought that they had was, therefore, I can't happily be a girl. And you can perfectly live your life if you are that type of athletic, assertive person. There's not a problem. I don't understand the problem. That why can't they go on and go to school and pursue what they like and they're been gifted at? And there's no not fitting in. I don't understand the thought that I can't fit in when you can. You just do your life and you contribute what you're good at and what you love to do, just like anyone else. I don't understand someone thinking, well, then, you're in the wrong body. It just seems such an illogical leap.
I think so. And I think a lot of it has to do with culture, too, because as you are even alluding to, other people are making fun of you, they're bullying you, and we just, in some respects, need to teach tolerance in a biblical sense of tolerance, not the way it is today, where we say we affirm any kind of lifestyle and any kind of sexual depravity, but a tolerance or a civility, treat others as you would like to be treated, the golden rule. I certainly think that has, because we've had people that have been intolerant, bigoted, bullying, that certainly needs to end as well. So, Susan, I appreciate that. I want to give a few more a chance to join the conversation because we've got a number of people that would like to express their opinion. So let's head up to Alaska this time. KJNP and Jim, thank you for joining us today. What would you like to add to our conversation?
Good morning. It's a comment, not necessarily a question.
That's okay.
But the Bible tells me that God knew me before I was born. So before I was born, he knew if I was Jim or June. So if I say after I'm born that I am in the wrong body, then that's intimating that God made a mistake. And I don't believe that God makes mistakes. So the devil and his minions have many insidious ways to carry on a spiritual war against God and Jesus. And by turning people against God's decision for them in their life is one way that is done.
Well, and again, let me just reinforce what you just said. God knew you from the beginning. Psalm 139, David's reflecting upon God's care for him. Jeremiah 1, God was calling Jeremiah out while he was still in his mother's womb. Isaiah 49. You've got quite a number of Old Testament passages that make your case. Now, that being said, you said God does not make mistakes. No, but we are born into a fallen world where there are mistakes. Because the question I always get when we speak on transgender or even on the issue of homosexuality, because I teach on this at least once or actually about twice a year, at least at 2 different Bible colleges, is, well, what about intersex, where it's hard to tell what the gender is of an individual? I said, we do live in a fallen world. We don't take the mistakes of nature and use those as the norm for what God intended. We do live in a fallen world, so sometimes there are some difficulties, there's some questions that aren't easily resolvable. But back to your key point, God knew us before we were born, and I think the real goal for any young person, whether they're suffering from gender dysphoria or not, is to really begin to say, what does God intend for me? I'm a unique individual. There's not another person out there that is just like me genetically. Even twins are different in some ways. And so you can say, God has given me a unique calling in ministry, and I really have the responsibility to figure out what God has called me to do. So, Jim, I really appreciate you reminding us about that.
Well, thank you. And like I say, I believe it's as much of a situation as a spiritual warfare, which the Bible plainly tells us is happening and will happen as we, to fulfill the prophecies, as it is a physical or emotional warfare.
Very good. Well, thank you for calling in. I've been up there at North Pole, Alaska and Fairbanks, and I look forward to seeing some of you again soon. We will get to the school shootings, those of you that want to comment about that, and that's my commentary today, but let me take one more on this issue of transgender first. And so we'll go to North Carolina on the Good News Network. Tony, what would you like to ask or add to our conversation today?
Good afternoon, my dear sir. God bless you and bless the station.
Thank you.
I know a young lady that has changed her sex and living like a boy. My question is, after they have done that surgical,
yes,
whatever,
it's called sex reassignment surgery, which is kind of a mouthful, but that's what it is.
Or sex mutilation.
Yeah. Yes.
Once they have done that, is the process reversible?
Some. And again, this is a family-oriented program, so I can't talk about the body parts, but you can kind of figure it out. As a matter of fact, it might be worthwhile for you or for this individual to think about getting a copy of the book, because Chapter 3 tells the stories of those people who detransitioned. Now, can you completely go back? Well, again, without being even a little bit difficult for some of our listeners here. You can imagine if you have gone from being a boy to a girl, going back to a boy, you can see there's some difficulties here. So that's part of it. And there also in Chapter 5 is a section on sex reassignment, what actually takes place. So my quick answer, since I'm coming to a break, is yes, some of it can be reversed, but you've got to understand that once you have done the reassignment surgery, you can't put back what you took out, number one. Number two, some of these hormonal treatments don't reverse themselves tomorrow, and that, of course, gets into that section that I only mentioned in passing, and that is we just don't know some of the long-term effects of some of these various kinds of hormones on individuals. And I love what Ryan Anderson said. Some of us, including my family, go to places or we purchase chickens that are organic. They aren't beef that doesn't is not all shut up with hormones. And so at a time when we're doing that, we're shooting up some of these kids with hormones. Got to rethink that a little bit. Let's come back. Some of you want to talk about school shootings. We'll do that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Can county commissioners open their own meetings with prayer? The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit recently prohibited Rowan County's commissioners from opening their meetings with prayer. But the federal courts of appeal are split over whether prayers offered by legislators at local government meetings are unconstitutional. In another one of our cases, Bournemouth versus County of Jackson, the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit approved of the very same practice. Opening government meetings with prayer is a centuries-old tradition that goes back to before the founding of our nation and continues to this day before Congress, state houses, and thousands of local governments across the country. It shouldn't be very controversial. The Supreme Court previously approved of the long-standing tradition of legislative prayer and its role in solemnizing policymaking sessions, encouraging lawmakers to selflessly seek the greater good, and acknowledging the role that faith plays in the lives of millions of Americans. In 1983, in Marsh v. Chambers, and then again in Town of Greece v. Galloway, the Supreme Court held that prayers offered by private citizens before government meetings are fully consistent with the Constitution and an important part of America's history and heritage. But what if that citizen is an elected official? That's the question we hope the Supreme Court will now answer. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes till top of the hour, and then the next hour we will have Lee Strobel in studio with us. We'll be talking about his new book, The Case for Miracles, and of course he also has written a very nice piece that we've posted as well, 4 Things Billy Graham's Life Can Teach Us, and he was preaching on that in church the other day, so we'll get into that as well. We have talked about the issue of transgender. I see some of you would like to address the issue of school shootings. Let me just mention my commentary today is entitled Gun Law Reform, because people say say we have to do something. Okay, let's do something that might actually make a difference. So I give you a couple of things that were actually suggested by Benjamin Durker in The Federalist on how to deal with the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, and then at least one idea by David French. And these, I think, would actually make a difference. But some people say, well, do something means ban all assault weapons. That's not going to happen, first of all. But even if you could ban the sale, first of all, the manufacture, sale, and distribution of assault weapons, and again, that's a misnomer because they are not assault weapons. That's just a name that's been given to them. But AR-15s, you would say, well, we still have millions out there. And so people say, well, we still got too many guns in the street. Well, then you're really talking about confiscating some of those weapons. And then it wouldn't be just AR-15s because you could AK-47s, you could have almost anything with a magazine, and pretty soon you'd have to say, well, anything other than maybe a revolver actually has to be banned because anything has multiple magazine, multiple opportunity to shoot. You can see this is not going to work. So again, let's get some of your comments about maybe how to deal with these school shootings before the top of the hour. We'll head first out to Arizona, KNLB. Jim, what would you suggest to us today here on Point of View?
Okay, thank you for having me on. I've listened to your station all my life. I'm 57 years old.
Well, thank you.
Okay, you bet. Okay, this is kind of simple. Around all the schools, they need to post signs. Absolutely no one allowed on the school property except staff, students, and vendors. Okay? And then when school gets out, you take your principal right on down to whoever feels comfortable, have them take an intense carry class concealed. And once it's known, all these signs around the schools that it's some kind of penalty, a misdemeanor if you come on the property, then once it's known, say somebody comes on the property, somebody sees it, well, the 3 or 4 armed people, the staff can go approach them and say, what are you doing on the property, for what reason? Now, say a student forgets their lunch or something, well, individually, they can go out, meet their parents, get what they need, and go back in the school. And it's just they need to add more exits in the schools and then let 20 kids out at a time in the big colleges and 5 or 6 exits and have that staff member there concealed and armed. And say, for instance, the principal or somebody looks up and somebody's coming on the property. Well, there's signs posted, you can't come on the property. So that's like a ringer to say, we better see what this guy's here for or why they're here. Because we can talk about guns, nothing's going to help that. There's too many people that have guns.
Right. And what you're suggesting is that do we really limit access to the school? Right now, people can walk in and out of school. I was amazed a number of years ago. I was invited to speak on a high school campus. Matter of fact, in the old days, back in the 70s and 30s, I did all the time. But even now, with all the heightened security, you just sort of almost walk through these places here and nobody stops you and said, can I help you? Why are you here? And we have these schools are much too open. And my argument has always been, if you're going to have a gun-free zone, then you have to do what you can to make sure that it is gun-free. And that means you're going to put up metal detectors and those kinds of things, or you're going to close down the campus so very few people can get in and out, which is what you're talking about. Now, the counter-argument, which I don't agree with, but the counter-argument, Jim, you're going to hear is, well, we're turning our schools into prisons. Well, right now, we're turning our schools into gun-free killing zones, so something needs to change, and your suggestion sure makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, it won't hurt to try it for a year. I mean, nobody's coming up with anything except the guns, and nobody's ever going to take that away. We know that.
We sure do.
I've been a gun owner since I was 11 years old. I've been a gun owner just for protection. I'm not into guns.
Yes. Well, let me go to another caller that is, I think, suggesting almost the same thing. And in the interest of time, I want to give as many of you a chance to join the conversation. So Jim suggested one thing. Orban in Texas, KBJS, I think you want us to learn from what is happening in Israel. Tell us more.
Oh, well, thank you, Kerby, for taking my call. Yes, sir. I've been corresponding with one of the resource officers that won a couple awards in the state of Texas, and he was telling me about how walking into the school to show ham radio demonstration was no problem. They didn't stop him. When I went over to the school system the other day for a Good News Club, carrying a guitar on my back, they didn't stop me, asked me what was in there. Kerby, Israel is very, very adept at the people in their school carrying weapons. And I think they should come over here and teach us how they're succeeding, because we don't seem to figure it out. And they have figured it out. It works for them. And those people are very intelligent. They've got a lot of things they've invented, especially in the medical field. And they are ready. They are armed. They are in the school. It's not taking away the guns. It's putting them in the right place at the right time with the right people.
Well said. I wish I had a little more time for all the comments here today, but let me just again recommend that if you would like to know a little bit more about some of these issues, and we'll certainly come back to this. I got a feeling the gun debate's going to go for quite a long period of time. My commentary today, if you haven't had a chance to hear it or would like to download it, so you can go to our website, pointofview.net. Talk about a couple of things. First of all, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System that we have. There are some things we can and should do. One of those is to clarify which authorities must report and which records need to be reported, because we well know that one particular problem was the Air Force failed to report some information about a man who killed more than 24 people in Sutherland Springs, Texas at First Baptist Church. So one of those is that. Another one comes from Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Charles Grassley. This is a bill that they proposed a number of years ago, still proposing it, and that is that it would actually increase criminal prosecutions of felons who try to buy guns. And Ted Cruz pointed out that last time they did this survey, they found there were about 48,000 felons and fugitives who lied and illegally tried to purchase guns. Well, we only prosecuted 44. Okay, 48,000, and we prosecuted 44. Okay, there's a problem there. And then one more in the interest of time, the piece by David French talks about this idea of a gun violence restraining order. It sometimes comes under different names, but this would be some of the laws being proposed in a number of states right now, which would empower family members or someone else who is close to the potential shooter to use courts to temporarily take the person's gun rights away. That might have helped in this particular case in Parkland, Florida. And he does point out that if you follow his article, which you can actually look up, says that this law might have stopped at least 4 of the mass shootings in the last 4 years, because there were some possibilities. My commentary tomorrow, which you can read as well, is, well, aren't there a lot of individuals, criminals and mass shooters getting their guns online? And we now have a report from the GAO, the Government Accounting Office, saying that that is not the problem it's been alleged to be. So again, we've got a couple of very helpful resources. It's all available at our website, pointofview.net. When we come back, we're going to talk with Lee Strobel. First about Billy Graham, then about his new book. All that coming up right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net, or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hours we've been promoting. We have in studio with us today Lee Strobel. He's been with us a number of times by phone, but it is just thrilling to have him in studio with us today. Again, an individual that you remember, graduated from the University of Missouri, then Yale Law School, went to the Chicago Tribune, was an award-winning legal editor, an atheist who became a Christian. And I remember interviewing him even before his Case for books came out, because we talked about some of the most outrageous claims. You remember those days?
I do. Oh, my gosh.
And then the Case for Christ, the Case for Faith, the Case for the Creator, the Case for Grace, the newest one, the Case for Miracles. And it is just delightful to have you in studio with us today.
It's great to be with you in person, to see you again, and I love your facility here. It's just a great, I feel like I'm at the nerve center for apologetics, and everything kind of radiates out from this location here. So,
well, we do spend a lot of time trying to help people articulate a biblical worldview and know how to defend a biblical worldview. Individual, of course, that served on the staff of Willow Creek Community Church as well as Saddleback Valley Community Church. Today, of course, you know him now as a professor at Houston Baptist University, and also an individual that has an opportunity to go to one of these really nice places in the Houston area, north, really, you know, and go and have a ministry in that church there as well. So we'll talk about some of that in just a minute. But before we do that, one of the articles I posted, and then you said you wanted to talk about it, is what you talked about in church yesterday. 4 things Billy Graham's life can teach us. It's on our website, pointofview.net, or you can just simply go to Fox News, the opinion piece. But we've all been talking about Billy Graham, but it is interesting that to a person, they talk about things like his integrity, his humility, and others. But take us through that, because you preached on this, so I know it's fresh of mind. And what can we learn from Billy Graham, maybe learn vicariously so that we can live the Christian life in a way that honors God?
Yeah, because, you know, a lot of people are saying, well, who's the next Billy Graham? And I think the answer is we all are.
Yes.
You know, there's not just one. There's millions of Billy Grahams. So all of us are called by God to be salt and light in whatever sphere of influence he's put us in. So I think all of the qualities that made Billy Graham so winsome and so effective are the same qualities we need to have as we share the gospel with people we know. And I think, as you mentioned, one of the things that comes to mind is his integrity.
Yes.
You know, and integrity.
No scandal that I can remember.
No. I mean, he really, you know, he never embarrassed embarrassed God by his actions and so forth. Of course, at the beginning of his ministry, they got together and said, how can we avoid some of the things that have messed up other evangelistic ministries, things like over-sensationalism, anti-intellectualism, sexual temptation, loose financial accountability. And they said, let's just address all those. And so they had strong financial accountability. They put Billy on a modest salary. They said, we're not ever going to be in the same room alone with a woman who's not our spouse. They were really careful to try to say, we're going to have integrity. And, you know, integrity is a word, you know, if you go back to the root, integer, remember from high school math, an integer is a whole number, like 1, 3, or 8, as opposed to a fraction. And so to understand integrity, it's really about a wholeness. It's a consistency between your character and your creed, between your beliefs and your behavior. And that's what we saw in Billy Graham. And it's so refreshing to see how everybody who knew him and knew of him and who watched him preach really sensed that this is a man who truly believed what he was saying, I even interviewed once Charles Templeton, who was his
Chuck Templeton. That's right.
one of his former pulpit partner and best friend, who became an agnostic.
Yes, he did.
Now, I believe he did come back to faith before he died. That's another story. But he became an agnostic, wrote a book called The Reasons Why He Rejected God and so forth. But I asked him about Billy Graham, and he said, Billy is pure gold. He said there was no fakery in him. There's no feigning in him. And so he talked about his character, and I think that's an important quality for all of us to have.
Well, I certainly think so. And again, the Modesto Manifesto is where they developed that, and that's the issue of integrity. And I've talked about that too. Integers and integrated, and who you are in private is who you are in public. And all the individuals over the years said that was the case, including his daughter. We quoted just the other day his daughter saying, he was just the same around us as he was there in the podium. But integrity was one. Another, humility. Billy Graham one time was asked, what will you say when you see God? And he's going to say, he said, why me? A farm boy from North Carolina. And he had that humility all of his life, didn't he?
He did. He used to tell a parable. If somebody would ask him, why are you so successful? He would say, imagine you're walking down a country road and you come upon a fence post, just a single fence post, and there's a turtle on the top of the fence post. You would not assume that turtle somehow climbed up on that fence post. You would assume that someone larger picked up that turtle, elevated it, and put it for some mysterious reason on top of that fence post. And he would just let that parable kind of sit there because the lesson was obvious, which is that, I didn't achieve this. For whatever reason, in his sovereignty, God chose to use me and in ways that I could never do myself. By the way, I once was talking to Will Graham, his grandson, and I said, tell me something about Billy that nobody knows. And it has to do with his humility and the simple life that he led. And he said, well, I'll tell you something. He said his favorite food. I said, well, what's that? He said, a corn dog from Sonic's. Now, now, how he lived to be 99 eating that, I don't know. But here's a simple man that just said, I am who I am because God, for whatever reason in his sovereignty, has chosen to use me.
Well, and Kathy Lee Gifford told the story, and we've posted that as well, that when she saw Billy, she said, I'll do anything for you. What do you want? And said, anything? Yeah. Give me a Big Mac. So again, a lot of fun. One more real quickly. He had compassion. Graham didn't tell people about Christ simply because he loved the spotlight, but because he loved God and he loved people.
Yeah, when he was speaking to huge stadiums at the height of his ministry, when he had a weekend off, he would wander the back roads of North Carolina and find these tiny little churches with 10 or 20 families, and he would go in and preach the gospel. Why would he do that? It wasn't because he was attracted by the spotlight and the large crowds. He loved God and he loved people. He was a compassionate person in that way. And I think it's appropriate. He'll be buried this Friday in a pine casket made by the inmates at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. That because he cared enough about them to go and to share the gospel with them.
For those of you who might remember Angola, we've had the warden from Angola on this program in studio. We've had interviews with some of the people that have ministered to the prisoners there that have achieved Bible degrees and things of that nature. But it is interesting, a pine box. And if you've been to Charlotte, you already see where Ruth is buried. You see where Billy's going to be buried. And we've got, I think, the International Society for Biblical Apologetics is in Charlotte this year, so maybe it's a good reason to go there and then go and see again the museum there for Billy Graham. We need to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about, well, first of all, we've got to talk about this movie. It is done very well, The Case for Christ, but then also, of course, a movie that you will find a little bit more about later on that we'll talk about because I think there's going to be a sequel. And then most importantly, we also have an opportunity for you today to advance order a copy of The Case for Miracles. So we have some of those links there on the website. And, of course, we also have a link to Lee Strobel, I guess it is. I put too many S's in there, .com, leestrobel.com, and there's a website there. We also have some more information about the book, but we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. He's in studio with us today. A little bit later, I'm going to open up the phones. If you've always had a question about apologetics or about theology, we'll do our best to answer it. And we will invite those phone calls right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, we have once again been hearing that we need to do something to stem gun violence. Even though most gun purchases are significantly regulated, are there any gun law reforms being proposed that make some sense? Well, Benjamin Durker, writing in The Federalist, proposes some reforms of the National Instant Criminal Background Check System that would make a difference. The system is composed of 3 databases, but not all relevant data is listed. For example, the Air Force failed to provide important information about the man who killed more than 24 people at the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. Legislation has been proposed to address this problem of inadequate records, but failed to pass in Congress. Another piece of legislation that has been proposed but not passed would increase criminal prosecutions of felons who tried to buy guns and would also criminalize straw purchases. The bill proposed by Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Charles Grassley would address the problem of people who lie on applications. Cruz says that in 2010 there were 48,000 felons and fugitives who lied and illegally tried to purchase guns. They prosecuted only 44 of them. David French writes about a way to deal with people who already have guns and pose a danger to society. It's called a gun violence restraining order. Various versions of these laws have been working their way through states, and it would empower family members and others close to a potential shooter to use the courts to temporarily take an individual's guns away. Obviously, it needs various safeguards. French shows how this law might have stopped at least 4 of the mass shootings in the last 4 years. We keep hearing that we need to do something. I think these types of common sense gun law reforms might actually prevent the next mass shooting. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
What a privilege to have in studio with us today, Lee Strobel, author of so many books. Let's go back to the one that, in a sense, made you famous. I knew you before you'd written Case for Christ. I knew as you were writing it. But nevertheless, look at the phenomenal impact first the book has, and now the movie is still out in Netflix. And so talk about how people, if they have not gone to the movie, shame on them, that how they can watch it or get a copy of it.
Yeah, it's available on Netflix, so there's one easy way, or the DVD and Blu-ray are available anywhere that DVDs and Blu-rays are sold. You know, when they approached me about doing the movie, the book's been out since almost 20 years.
Yes.
And so all of a sudden I get a phone call from 2 studios in the same week saying, hey, we'd like to make a movie out of your book. And I thought, you know, a lot of people won't read a 300-page book. A lot of people won't go to church, but they'll go to a movie. And so I said, okay, and we trusted PureFlix, because here's an interesting thing. When you kind of sell your life story for a true life movie, you have no real control over that. It's you know, you got to trust them with it, and we did, and they came through, and we're thrilled with the movie. And it was funny. My wife Leslie, they sent us an advance copy that we could watch on our computer, and so I walked in one day, and she was watching it again. I said, "Honey, how many times have you seen the movie?" She said, 10 times.
Wow.
And I said, "Why do you keep watching it?" And she said, "I'm trying to get cried out." so that I don't cry in public when we see it for the first time. And, of course, we both cried when we saw it in public.
Well, I'm just thrilled you brought her today.
Yes.
And she comes off looking real good in the film, and you don't come off looking quite so good. I would think that I'd be watching going, do we have to cover that part of our relationship? But yes.
You know, that was the hard part, because I'm not proud of my life before I was a Christian.
Yes.
I mean, I was a immoral living, narcissistic, drunken, atheist, and so I'm not proud of that, and I'm not proud to have my behavior on the screen, but we wanted to tell the true story.
Yes, and you do.
And you do, and, obviously God is the hero, but other than God, Leslie is the hero of the film.
And if nothing else, it illustrates something you and I both said over the years. The reason we believe the Bible is true is it tells the story warts and all.
Yeah, that's true.
You really have trouble finding a perfect person other than Jesus in the Bible.
Yeah.
Maybe Joseph or Daniel, a little bit.
Yeah.
But, whether it's David or Solomon or the Apostle Paul or Peter, I mean, you get it all. And there's a sense in which there was just a ring of authenticity in that film because you were so honest.
And we felt like if we had pulled punches, people would call us on it. And so we thought, we'll just let it all out there. And, of course, in a movie, you have to do some time shifting. You have to do some composite characters and so forth. But it's about 85% accurate, which for one of these kind of based on true life stories is really high. There are scenes that are just ripped from our lives. Some of the arguments we had.
Yes.
Oh, my gosh. Every time I watch them, I just kind of, I had one friend watch, and he said, I didn't know you were such a jerk. And I thank God Jesus came in and changed my life, because who knows how things would have ended up.
And people want to know if your hair really looked like that. But again,
the hair did, but I never had the mustache. I could never. Now, you've got a nice mustache.
Yeah.
I can't grow a mustache. I wish I could.
I thought that was pretty good. We already have calls coming in, so if you'd like to join us, I might as well open up the phones.
Sure.
Because when Lee Strobel is here, of course, lots of questions. 1-800-351-1212. Let's talk about the case for miracles.
Yeah.
A lot of people, interestingly enough, maybe haven't really thought through this issue very much because they've not read David Hume or others, but they are influenced by this mindset that says miracles can't happen. Even Christians sort of say, I'm going to stay away from talking about the miracles of Christ because, well, I really can't make the case.
Yeah.
But Jesus didn't stay away from the miracles, nor did any of the first century disciples, apostles, or even church fathers. So what's gone on with us in this 21st century where we even can't talk about miracles?
Well, it's interesting when you talk to an atheist, and I start my book out with an interview with a skeptic, Michael Shermer, one of the most famous skeptics in America, and I let him build a case against miracles. And then the rest of the book kind of responds to that case, builds the affirmative case. But, it's inevitable. They quote David Hume, and David Hume, a 17th century Scottish philosopher, made a fundamental error. And, philosophers have called him on it. In fact, there's a book by a non-Christian philosopher published by Oxford University Press, and the title of the book is Hume's Abject Failure. I mean, he was in terms of what he says about miracles, he's just wrong. And why is he wrong? Because he says miracles are a violation of the laws of nature. Well, no, they're not. And he says you can't violate the laws of nature, therefore miracles can't happen. Well, they're not a violation of laws of nature. I've got a copy here, an advanced copy of my book. If I were to drop this, the law of gravity says it would hit the floor. But if I dropped it and you reached in and grabbed it before it hit the floor, you're not violating the law of gravity. You're just intervening.
Right.
And this is what God does. He created the world. He can intervene in it. He's not overturning or violating the laws of nature. He's merely intervening. So Hume was wrong in his assessment, and I think it's more reasonable to say, what is the evidence that God continues to intervene in the world? It's interesting. When I did the book, I commissioned George Barnett to do a national survey and to find out what are the attitudes of people toward miracles. And I found some interesting things. One of them is that 51% of Americans say that they believe the miracles in the Bible happened as they're described.
Wow.
And I thought, in this skeptical world,
That's
51%
amazing.
is pretty high.
Yeah.
Only 15% said the miracles can't happen today. 2/3 said they can. But here's the most interesting thing. 38% of American adults said, I have had an experience in my life that I can only explain as being a miracle of God.
Isn't that amazing?
38%. And I bet you if I asked your audience right now, raise your hand.
I bet there'd be more.
There'd be a lot of folks who would say that. 75% of evangelicals say it.
Yes.
But what's interesting then, you extrapolate that number out. That means there's 94,750,000 miracles we're talking about. Now, let's say 95% of those are mistakes. Let's say they're really just extraordinary coincidences. That still leaves 4.7 million miracles. I think miracles are more common than we think. Many of them are more documented than we think, and I document many of them in my book. We have scientific studies published in peer-reviewed scientific and medical journals that analyze the impact of healing prayer and so forth. I think we have good evidence that God is still active in intervening in the world. But, something else you said, though, about the skepticism thing, which is really interesting. One of my chapters, I talk about the fact that many American churches are embarrassed by the supernatural.
Right.
They're embarrassed. They want to be seen as respectable. They don't want to think their neighbors. They don't want the neighbors to think they're like some weird televangelist or something. So they want to be respectable and so forth. And so a lot of even Christians will downplay the miraculous. And I think those that do, and I'm not coming from a charismatic background. I'm a mainstream evangelical, but I believe that God still does miracles. And some of the stories in the book that are just blow my mind. And as Sheila Walsh, the Christian singer, said, if The Case for Christ, if you like that book, The Case for Miracles will cause you to fall on your knees in worshiping God, because he is a God of love, of grace, of compassion, who to this day intervenes in ways that just blow our minds.
Yes. One of the other arguments that David Hume made is that, because miracles are extremely rare and improbable, then they can't possibly be true. And because you like baseball like I do, I've collected so many stories over the years of people, for example, in the stands that have caught 3 consecutive home run balls. Yeah. One that was happening out in Arizona where this woman got hit by a pitch and so knocked her out. They were carrying out in a gurney. The next pop fly hit her. So we got all sorts of unbelievably improbable things that happen in our world. Yeah. And again, miracles by their definition are rare. Right. But at the same time, if you use your number of more than 4 million, they're not as rare as we'd like to believe. And so social media has helped us collect some of that. That's true. So let's take a break. We're going to continue our conversation about this book on the Case for Miracles. It is coming out shortly, and so we've got a couple of things. First of all, we have a link to leestrobel.com. Now, there's a trailer there for the Case for Christ. So if you have not had a chance to see that, or if you'd like to help promote it, we encourage you to watch the trailer, and then once you do so, we encourage you to click on that button that says share, because that will be an opportunity for you to then share that. It's about 2 minutes long, and so that will give you some information. We also, of course, have information about this book, The Case for Miracles, and you can advance order it. It's in hardback, Kindle, and also an audiobook coming out, I guess. So that's available. And then I'm also posted a piece by Tim McGrew, because he's been on the studio with us before, Miracles and the Laws of Science. And also, he's come up with a way in which we can sometimes use, I think, reasonable common sense tests about miracles and some of these claims of miracles, and how, again, the biblical miracles pass the test and all these other alleged miracles fail. So it's just one more argument, I think, for the authority of Scripture and the inspiration of Scripture. But if you'd like to join us, when you have Lee Strobel in studio, I know some of you have had some questions about the Case for Christ, the Case for Faith, the Case for Creator, the Case for Grace, or some of the others. We'll give you that opportunity. Last half hour, let's open up the phones. 1-800-351-1212. We are so privileged to have him in studio, and if you'd like to listen to this again, don't forget you can also download a podcast or watch it again on YouTube in just about an hour. Let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
Imagine you work where you know people do not share your faith, and they certainly don't agree with a Christian view of life and culture. You are surrounded by hostility every single day. How important would it be to have solid information to back you up? Jim in South Carolina listens to Point of View in the afternoons. He writes, I teach in a public secular university and enjoy actually being a voice for the biblical Christian worldview in a liberal setting. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for being bold and proclaiming truth. And Jim finishes, I pray for you daily. Jim works in hostile territory, and he prays for Point of View because Point of View is a source of truth. Please help us continue being here for Jim and everyone else. We need you to visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151 and join the Truth Team. Enable us to be here each day by giving each month. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Lee Strobel as we talk about his new book, The Case for Miracles. Might just mention that he is also the professor of Christian thought at Houston Baptist University and also a teaching pastor at Woodlands Church. My wife, if she weren't living here, she'd love to live in the Woodlands. What a wonderful place where you are, and we'd come to your church.
You know why I'm in the Woodlands? My two oldest grandchildren live right around the corner.
I know that, too, so that's really fun. But let's talk about HBU for just a minute. Earlier today, I did another show on another network, or another station, I should say, and we had two graduates, one a graduate, one almost a graduate from HBU. But Houston Baptist is just incredible what the first of all, the president and some of you fellow professors have put together. It's an outstanding program. Talk about what people can find when they go to hbu.edu.
Well, thanks for mentioning that. You know, we have really expanded in the area of apologetics. We have more women professors of apologetics than any school in the world. We have some just terrific faculty. Craig Evans, one of the great New Testament scholars. Jeremiah Johnson, who I know you know very well, a great young scholar.
We had Nancy Piercy on the other
Nancy
day.
Piercy.
Love Thy Body.
Yes, she's fantastic. You know what's funny? I never met Nancy Piercy, and I saw her picture, and I thought, okay, she's probably very reserved and kind of like a librarian type. So I meet her in the hallway at HBU. Nicest person in the world. We stood in that hallway in the stairwell. We must have talked for 45 minutes. She's just wonderful. I just love Nancy Piercy. So we're thrilled about what God's doing. I teach a course there every semester on evangelism.
Right.
And it's open to the community. People come from around the country. You can come in, and it's on a Thursday night, Friday night, all day Saturday. So it's kind of a compact little thing. It's 1 credit hour. And we have a great time just talking about how do we share our faith in an increasingly skeptical world.
Well, again, I might just mention that tomorrow I'll get a chance to see you. You'll be speaking at a banquet associated with Dallas Theological Seminary. So thank you for doing that as well. Let's get back to the book, The Case for Miracles. You know, we've talked about David Hume a little bit. Let's move on to one of the other sections, and that is Science, Dreams, and Visions.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, one of the interviews you do is with Tom Doyle, who's been on the program many times, not only in this studio but other studios, because we've known each other forever, it seems like. And he has found that as you talk to Muslims, let me talk about Muslims that have become Christians, a fair number of them have had visions.
Yes.
Now, a lot of people discount those, but when you go back and look at some of those visions, they're biblically accurate visions, right?
Yeah, they are. I mean, there are 200 examples in Scripture of God using visions and dreams for his purposes. And, you know, I don't think that's ended, because when we look at the Muslim world, where 50% are illiterate and so they can't read Scripture, where 90% don't know a Christian, and so they don't have a friend to share the faith with them, how does God reach them? Well, he, in his creativity, often appears. Jesus appears to them in dreams. And one of the reasons that, and we have to be careful about this kind of stuff, but one of the things about these dreams is that there is often external confirmation. Right. What I mean by that is, in the dream, I'll give you an example. There was a woman, a mother of several children in Egypt, Cairo, a Muslim. She has a dream, and in the dream she meets Jesus, and Jesus says, I love you, I died for you. And she's just overwhelmed by being in his presence. And she says, tell me more. How do I, and he says, well, my friend will tell you. And she said, well, who's your friend? And he stepped aside, and he's been here the whole time. And there's this man with him. So that's the end of the dream. The next day, she's in the crowded market in Cairo, and she sees the guy who was in her dream. And she runs over to him and says, you were in my dream. You were in my dream. And so he was a Christian, a missionary, and he shares Jesus with her. And that's kind of the pattern. But I'll tell you a funny story. In the Woodlands, Texas, we have a lot of connection with the Middle East because of the oil industry. And so we had a woman who was a Muslim who had got married when she was in a closed country to the gospel. But she'd called out to God because God didn't seem real to her. And she said, God, if you're real, I want to know you. And so she moves with her husband to the Woodlands. She meets she has a dream in which Jesus appears to her. No, I take it back. In her particular dream, Jesus didn't appear. She had a dream in which she's standing in water, like a lake, with a man who had a book, and the man is looking off in the horizon, and he's crying. And she didn't know anything about baptism. And so she has this dream. Well, she meets a member of our church, and they become friends. She invites her to come to Easter services at our church. So she's sitting in the auditorium before the service starts, and Alan Splawn, one of our pastors who does baptisms, comes walking down the aisle, and she looks, that's him. That's the man from my dream. And Alan comes up, shares Jesus with it. Anyway, she ends up coming to faith, and sure enough, in the lake, she's baptized just as she had this dream. Well, how do you explain that? Is that a mere coincidence? I think God in his love and his grace does what it takes to reach those who are calling out to the one true God to know about him.
What I think is so interesting, I'll share one of my stories, which is probably not in the book, but it's one of our DTS grads who was telling me about this Muslim that had this dream, and he described it to him, and he said, well, I know where that dream is. It's in the book of Zechariah, and pulls out that, and it's point by point. Now, that one required a seminary graduate to know exactly what's in the book. Not exactly the book that everybody's reading in their quiet time every day. But you just have such specificity in some of these that you recognize that some people have weird dreams, and that's just because of the pizza they ate last night. So I'm with you on that.
Well, and Nabil Qureshi, who became a Muslim turned Christian, a great Christian apologist, he had, and I talk about in the book, very specific dreams that corresponded to Scripture that he had never read before.
Right.
And that's
like this one,
Yeah, that was an element that helped bring him to faith.
Yeah. We are sure missing Nabil Qureshi.
I know. What a great, he was a good friend.
Yeah.
I remember holding his hand just a few days before he died, and
very sad.
I'm going to get emotional, but, God's hand was on his life in such a remarkable way, and he led so many people to faith. Anybody out there who wants to understand Islam, his book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, is a masterpiece, and his legacy that I believe God's going to continue to use for generations to come.
Yes. Well, we've interviewed him here, and you can try to type his name, but we can help you out if you need it. We can give you the title of the book, which you'll be able to find on our website as well. We talked a little bit about science, dreams, and visions, but I didn't do the science part very good, and that's Dr. Candy Gunther Brown.
Right.
And that's one of those places where science is our friend.
That's right.
Right?
Absolutely. What she did, now she's a PhD from Harvard. She's a professor at Indiana University.
You went to the other school.
Yeah.
For those of us that went to Yale.
That's right.
Yeah.
So she took a team to Mozambique where there had been an outbreak of reports of the supernatural and miracles. And she said, let's test this. So she got together a team. They would go into a village in the middle of nowhere. They would call out all the people who are blind or deaf. They would test them. So they tested them scientifically, their sight and their vision. And then people, Christians, would lay hands on them and pray for them in the name of Jesus for healing. And then they would immediately test them again for their hearing or their vision. And what they found is virtually all of them had significant improvements immediately. One woman came in. She could not hear a jackhammer next to her ear. 10 minutes of prayer in the name of Jesus, hands laid on her, she could hear a conversation. I mean, her hearing was just restored to that degree. Candy Gunther Brown then took her team to Brazil to see if she could replicate this, and sure enough, same thing happened. Now, the key thing is this study, which is scientifically valid, has been published in the peer-reviewed Southern Medical Journal, a secular scientific medical publication has looked at the way in which that study was conducted and said this meets the test of a scientific study. And that tells you something that, no, we can't put God in a bottle. No, we can't. Miracles are not replicatable. And therefore, the typical scientific testing often doesn't work in terms of trying to test them. But this kind of test can actually point us toward something supernatural going on.
Well, we're talking about science. We need to take a break, but I want to come back and talk about the miraculous universe. That's another one of those arguments. We'll borrow a little bit from the case for the creator and some of the material that we've talked about with intelligent design, but we need to take a break. We'll come back and get into that as well. And again, you will find that this book, very similar to the other books by Lee Strobel, where he gives you some content but then does some interviews. And that was a motif that worked so well for the Case for Christ and all the other books. So you'll benefit from that. Let me again encourage you to go to the website today. We've got a couple of links, and the most important one, of course, is to leestrobel.com. As you click there, we first of all would encourage you to educate maybe a few people in your sphere of influence. Maybe they don't know about the Case for Christ or about the movie. We have the trailer there, and you know what I always ask you to do. Watch the trailer, then click the share button. Put it on your Facebook page. Put it on the Twitter account. And then, of course, you have all the information about the Case for Christ, the information about the Case for Miracles, and you might do the same thing because we've given you an opportunity there to advance order that. either in hardback or Kindle. You can also send that to someone. Maybe there's a person in your church that would really benefit from that. And back to the point we made just a minute ago, if you read this book, it will bring you to your knees, right? Isn't that what we're hearing?
Yeah, it just, you're so in awe of what God can and does do as he intervenes in our lives. It's amazing.
The Case for Miracles. We'll continue our conversation with Lee Strobel right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Can county commissioners open their own meetings with prayer? The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit recently prohibited Rowan County's commissioners from opening their meetings with prayer. But the federal courts of appeal are split over whether prayers offered by legislators at local government meetings are unconstitutional. In another one of our cases, Bournemouth versus County of Jackson, the Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit approved of the very same practice. Opening government meetings with prayer is a centuries-old tradition that goes back to before the founding of our nation and continues to this day before Congress, state houses, and thousands of local governments across the country. It shouldn't be very controversial. The Supreme Court previously approved of the long-standing tradition of legislative prayer and its role in solemnizing policymaking sessions, encouraging lawmakers to selflessly seek the greater good, and acknowledging the role that faith plays in the lives of millions of Americans. In 1983, in Marsh v. Chambers, and then again in Town of Greece v. Galloway, the Supreme Court held that prayers offered by private citizens before government meetings are fully consistent with the Constitution and an important part of America's history and heritage. But what if that citizen is an elected official? That's the question we hope the Supreme Court will now answer. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. We have Lee Strobel in studio talking about the case for miracles. And before we end, I need to do something I meant to talk about earlier, and that is you're having this free webcast.
Yes.
And this is a rollout for the new book, The Case for Miracles. So it's free.
Yes.
People can sign up, but let's tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, we're going to do it live, simulcast from Nashville, Tennessee on the evening of March the 14th, which is a Wednesday night. A lot of churches are using it as an outreach event. Small groups are using it to stimulate discussion. Individuals can access it. Your website, I think, probably has a link where people can get to it.
And we really want churches to maybe think about using it in Wednesday night church.
Exactly.
I go to a church that doesn't meet every Wednesday night, but they meet Wednesday night once a month.
It's perfect for that.
If you're already there, that's great to educate so many people.
And it's not a promotion for the book in the sense that it being an infomercial. It's content. We're going to talk about the case for miracles, and we're going to see an interview I did with a woman who had the single most well-documented, incredible miracle I encountered in my 2-year investigation of the supernatural.
So again, and that comes out of Virginia. Is that where she is?
Yeah, she is in Virginia now. Her story quickly is she was had multiple sclerosis. She was dying. She was in hospice. She was curled up like a pretzel. Her wrists, her fingers were curled to touch her wrists. Her feet were extended. She had a tube in her throat to breathe. One lung was collapsed. The other lung was half collapsed. Her diaphragm was paralyzed. She was virtually blind. She could only see shadows. She had her waste products removed by tubes and so forth. She had not walked in 7 years. We documented 450 people began praying for her because a radio station announced, pray for Barbara. She's on her deathbed. And so 450 people wrote letters saying, I'm praying for you. So on Pentecost Sunday, her sisters are there reading her some of these letters that people had written saying, I'm praying for you. And she's in bed and listening to this, and she hears a man's voice coming from right beyond her sisters that said, get up, my child, and walk. And she hears this, the voice of God, and what does she do? They take the tube out of her throat. She gets out of bed. She's standing. Her eyesight is returned. Her mother comes in, falls to her knees, and grabs her calves and says, you have calves again. In other words, her legs had atrophied from not walking for 7 years. Her calves had returned instantaneously. She begins dancing with her father. She goes to church that night and walks down the aisle, and people who knew her being in a wheelchair on her deathbed just began singing Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. And I once was blind, but now I see. Yes. She came in to see her doctor. Her doctor said, who was an atheist, said, I thought it was an apparition. I thought it was a ghost. And he said, it's a miracle. This is her atheist doctor. 2 doctors have written books about it because it is such a well-documented case. Her illness was totally well-documented. Her recovery was so instantaneous that you can't write it off as saying it was just some sort of spontaneous remission. Spontaneous remissions generally happen over a period of time, and they often return with the other illness. The illness comes back. She's been healed now for 37 years. Perfect health to this day. And she... and how do you explain this voice of God that she hears that tells her to get up and walk? Totally the last thing in the world that, she literally had oxygen being pumped into her from canisters in the garage so she could breathe. And now she's dancing with her father. I'm telling you, you see stories like that, and I have the documentation of it in the book. I just interviewed her on video. We're going to show it at our live simulcast on March 14th. It causes me to just be in awe of God and say, it's just such a great example of his love and grace that he would do this. And of course, it raises a question, well, what about miracles that don't happen? And so many of us, my wife Leslie, has a medical condition that has her in pain every day of her life. And we have prayed for years for her healing, and it's not happened. A miracle has not occurred. And so I have a chapter in my book on that topic.
Right. Difficulties with miracles and when miracles don't happen and those kinds of things.
I interviewed, I don't know if you know Douglas Groothuis from Denver Seminary.
He used to be on probe staff, and he was just on here the other day when he was writing about his sweet wife who also is struggling with dementia and all that. Yes.
Exactly. And that's what I interviewed him about. Because here's a philosopher who can talk about it theologically and philosophically, but who himself, his own wife, is going through this dementia. Becky. And it's a heartbreaking thing. But he writes in this chapter, I think it's the most powerful chapter in any of my books, where he talks from his heart and from his head about this question of what about unanswered prayer? Prayer that isn't answered in the way that we want it to be answered.
Yes. Well, again, he's been on the program with us talking about his wife, and of course he was on probe staff with us, and then eventually went, of course, to Denver Seminary.
I think we know everybody in common.
Yes,
I bet if we listed all our friends, it'd be like 100%.
I think there's only 100 Christians because when you play the Do You Know game, we all know everybody.
Right, that's true.
But let's go back to March 14th. Now that story, as I like to say sometimes, if that does not light your fire, your wood is wet.
Yeah, there you go.
That will cause, I think, all of our listeners to want to sign up and get that webcast, that simulcast that is taking place March 14th. You can get some more information. Of course, you can go to your website. That link is there as well.
It's totally free.
And again, it's just an opportunity for people to know a little bit more about that. But the Case for Miracles coming out. And just before we run out of time, I wanted to ask you, do you have some other films coming out or other projects? A lot of people always say, what's the next thing for Lee Strobel? So answer that question.
We do, actually, and I think this may be the first time it's been announced, but PureFlix, that made the movie on the Case for Christ, is making a film on the Case for Miracles.
I figured.
Yep, and that will come out in September of 2019. The screenwriter is Brian Bird, who also wrote The Case for Christ, good friend of mine. He begins working on the script. The treatment is done. The script begins next month, and it'll be all of the miracles in that film will be well-documented, true stories that we're going to have a website that you can go to and see the documentation so you can go further if you'd like. But it's a story about my life and about my pursuit of the supernatural to try to determine, is God still active in this way in the world? And so it kind of tells that story. It tells the story of Leslie and what she suffers from, and how, we haven't had that kind of answer to prayer that we've looked for in the way that we want, and how do we wrestle with that? But it also looks at some of these cases that just make our heart, I think, grow bigger toward God.
Well, again, the book is one that about 200 pages, and a section on the case against miracles, which we talked about with Michael Shermer, the case for miracles, then science, dreams, and visions, the most spectacular miracles, and of course some of those have to do with the miracle of creation and science and the miracle of the resurrection with J. Warner Wallace, and then difficulties with miracles, embarrassed by the supernatural, Roger Olson, and of course when miracles don't happen, Doug Groothuis. So just all sorts of great resources. And again, you can look for it in your local bookstore. It's published by Zondervan. We've given you an opportunity to advance order it. And again, I want to encourage you to watch this trailer and send it out to some others. And I kind of almost let the cat out of the bag earlier when I said, aren't we got another film coming? Yeah, Case for Miracles. So now you announced it, so we've done that as well. March 14th, another date you want to circle on your calendar and make
you can
a
go
point
to caseformiracles.live is the direct link to that to sign up.
We've got all that as well. Lee Strobel, thank you for driving up from Houston. I'm looking forward to hearing you tomorrow at the Dallas Seminary Banquet.
Thank you, sir. Always great to be with you. Thank you for what you do for the cause of Christ. It's inspiring, it's instructional, and you're making a huge difference around the planet.
Well, so are you. And a man that is certainly one of the great assets to the Christian faith, and it's just a delight to have him in studio with us today. If you find yourself saying, that went too fast, I'd like to hear this again. The good news is you can go to our website, click on the button that says listen. You can download the podcast. If you'd like to see us in studio, you can click on the one that says watch, or you can go to YouTube channel or to Facebook Live. There are multiple places where you can listen to this or hear it again. So take the time to maybe watch it or listen to it. Maybe pass it on to someone else that might be encouraged by some of the conversation we've had about Billy Graham and about miracles. It's all available on our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's